The air temperature is lying to you. In France, at least 40 people seeking relief drown trying to find it. In Spain, estimates suggest 212 people may have been killed by the heat in just 4 days. Across Europe, a staggering 101 million people endured a single day where the mercury climbed above 35 degrees C. The World Health Organization has classified this not as a mere heat wave, but as a health emergency. And now, the same phenomenon is manifesting across the Atlantic as the United States walks into a furnace of its own. But the truly dangerous metric is hiding. The true line of human survival is closer than science ever believed. While official records seem to fall everywhere, they are not merely nudging past old marks. They are being obliterated by margins that suggest the baseline itself is shifting upward. The geography of this event defies intuition, suggesting these are not isolated incidents but symptoms of a single condition. A dome of high pressure is parked over Western Europe, while simultaneously, a second high-pressure dome sits over the central and eastern United States. This spatial paradox points to a massive hemisphere-wide anomaly in the fundamental atmospheric circulation, a single physical machine operating across 2 continents. In France, this manifested as temperature warnings triggering for more than half the mainland departments, hundreds of schools closing as buildings became unsafe, and the highest temperature ever recorded in mainland French history, 44.3 degrees C. In Italy, heat alerts flashed red across 16 major urban centers simultaneously. In Britain, the previous hottest June day, which had stood for nearly 50 years since the legendary hot summer of 1976, was erased in an afternoon. This is the deception. We have built our systems and intuition around the air temperature, but the real danger is a hidden concept scientists call the wet bulb temperature. This metric is the single most important variable defining human survival, the point at which the body can no longer physically cool itself through sweat, regardless of water consumption or shade. It is a strict physical threshold. When the air is saturated with moisture at a certain temperature, evaporation stops, and within 6 hours, core body temperature climbs relentlessly until organ failure and death occur. The entire architecture of this crisis hinges on this mechanism, and the theoretical limit was long believed to be a wet bulb reading of 35 degrees C, but the entire premise of that safety margin just collapsed. Systemic and groundbreaking new research has revealed the true boundary. For younger, healthy adults, the line of collapse is not 35 degrees but closer to 30.5 degrees wet bulb. And for older adults, the lethal barrier drops even further, into the low 20s. We have spent generations monitoring the wrong metrics, calibrating our warning systems to a mathematical abstraction while a vast, vulnerable population was living microns away from an invisible physical limit. This discovery creates an immediate conceptual fault line. If the records are falling by degrees but the threshold for survival is also several degrees lower than the models presumed, we face a sudden, terrifying compression of safety reserves. The crisis is not waiting for future decades. It is happening right now in real time. We are operating beyond the architectural limits of the system we thought we understood. With the genuine limit of human survival now placed far lower, we are forced to ask a question that changes every map, every forecast, and every assumption we hold about livable conditions on this planet. With the old ruler now broken, how much actual room is left before parts of this hemisphere cross a line from which there is simply no physical coming back? To understand the physical collapse of a human system under these conditions, we must analyze the thermodynamic reality of how the living organism interacts with its environment. The human body behaves like a continuous thermal engine, constantly burning fuel to sustain basic cell functions and generating metabolic heat that must be rejected. The internal core temperature must stay locked within a fraction of a degree, around 37 degrees C. If this core temperature is forced upward by even a small margin, the structural integrity of life begins to dissolve. Proteins begin to denature, losing their precise shapes exactly like an egg white turning solid in a hot pan, causing cell membranes to leak, organs to fail, and a fatal cascade of hypothermia to take over the entire system. The primary engineering solution the body has evolved to shed this thermal load is the evaporation of sweat. When water transitions from a liquid state to a vapor on the skin, it absorbs phase change energy from the body, dumping that heat directly into the ambient air. But this entire phase change mechanism is bound by a strict environmental constraint. The air must have ambient capacity to accept that moisture. If the surrounding atmosphere is already saturated with water vapor, the sweat cannot evaporate. It simply pools on the skin and drips off uselessly, providing zero cooling effect. This is the precise danger captured by the wet bulb temperature, which factors in both the ambient air heat and the relative humidity to determine the exact boundary where evaporative cooling drops to absolute zero. A standard dry thermometer hides this atmospheric saturation entirely, presenting a narrative that is far gentler than the truth. A dry, low-humidity environment at 110 degrees F allows rapid sweat evaporation and remains physically endurable. Conversely, a humid environment at 95 degrees F can become an absolute death trap because the moisture content in the air completely seals off the body's only cooling pathway. When a system crosses this critical wet bulb threshold, drinking water cannot alter the physical laws at play. Hydration keeps an individual from dying of dehydration, but it does nothing to prevent thermal death. The sweat glands can continuously pump water onto the skin, but because the phase change pathway is physically blocked by the saturated air, not a single unit of thermal energy leaves the body. As cooling fails, the body descends a rigid structural staircase of physical degradation. The initial stage of heat exhaustion, marked by a racing heart, clammy skin, dizziness, and nausea, is a systemic warning shot that the body is losing the equilibrium fight. If the environmental load continues, the system hits the catastrophic state of heat stroke. The internal core temperature spikes past 40 degrees C, causing the cooling architecture to break down completely. Sweating stops entirely, the skin dries out, and the brain malfunctions, leading to slurred speech, confusion, and unconsciousness. This internal load forces the cardiovascular system to pump massive volumes of blood toward the peripheral skin surface to dump heat, straining the heart while the blood thickens from fluid loss. For an older or structurally weakened cardiovascular system, this workload becomes an impossible stress, causing the heart to stop completely. This is why the vast majority of heat fatalities are recorded on death certificates as cardiac or respiratory failures rather than thermal events. The underlying wet bulb temperature acts as an invisible killer, stopping hearts one by one in closed apartments, care homes, and vehicles without leaving a single piece of visible wreckage. This structural vulnerability is highly stratified across the population. The recent laboratory research dismantled the myth of personal fitness as an absolute shield. Even the youngest, healthiest individuals began to suffer core temperature instability at an average wet bulb reading of 30.5 degrees C because their skin was warmer and real-world sweat evaporation is inherently imperfect compared to theoretical models. For the frail, the chronically ill, and the elderly, the survival limit plunges deep into the low 20s on the wet bulb scale, conditions that most healthy people would categorize as a pleasant, warm afternoon. The healthy majority looks at a standard thermometer and assumes the environment is safe, completely blind to the fact that the vulnerable individuals standing directly next to them are being quietly pushed past their absolute structural limits. This structural breakdown is not a localized incident, but the visible output of a single macro geophysical engine. The massive scale paradox of this event lies in the absolute simultaneity of the crisis across two distinct continents. At the exact hour a Spanish farmer watches the thermometer climb toward 45 degrees C, an urban commuter in New York struggles through air thick with humidity, and a resident in Rome sits in an apartment that has not cooled below 30 degrees C for days. This is a single hemispheric fever, driven by a structural shift in the atmospheric circulation patterns that pins extreme heat across thousands of miles at once. When identical record-breaking anomalies manifest simultaneously on opposite sides of an ocean, systems analysis dictates that we look for a single cause large enough to drive both. That cause is a major structural failure in the planetary jet stream. Normally, this high-altitude river of air flows rapidly and smoothly from west to east, driven by the sharp temperature differential between the freezing Arctic and the warm tropics. This thermal contrast acts as the primary engine for the system, keeping the jet stream confined to a straight, powerful channel. However, the Arctic is warming 3 to 4 times faster than the global baseline due to Arctic amplification. As the cold end of this planetary equation heats up rapidly, the thermal gradient between the pole and the equator shrinks. Denied its primary temperature engine, the jet stream slows down, weakens, and begins to wander, buckling into massive, exaggerated, slow-moving kinks that loop far to the north and south, where this planetary wave bulges north. It drags up a massive dome of tropical air, compressing and heating it day after day in a stationary high-pressure trap. This is precisely what has parked itself over Western Europe and the United States simultaneously. These heat domes are not two separate coincidental weather events, they are two lobes of the exact same buckled, frozen wave pattern in the sky. And because this wave is stationary, it locks the extreme conditions in place for days and weeks, turning a hot spell into a prolonged, crushing siege. Paradoxically, directly adjacent to these ridges of extreme heat, the deep south plunging troughs of the same broken wave drag Arctic air down into the western United States, creating the jarring spectacle of late June snow accumulating in the high peaks of the northern Rockies, while the east coast flirts with triple digits. The unseasonable cold and the historic heat are not opposites. They are the shared mechanical output of a single fractured system. This planetary lock has catastrophic consequences for the human infrastructure below it. Across Europe, the system has run up an invisible body count of 200,000 deaths over the past 4 years alone, a staggering toll that barely registers in public awareness because heat leaves no visible wreckage, no flattened buildings, and no debris fields. It simply induces quiet systemic failures in individual care homes and bedrooms. The baseline numbers from the current wave are already severe. At least 40 people in France drowned in rivers and lakes as they naturally fled the furnace of the air, and 18 died from direct thermal exposure, including 2 children left in a vehicle. In Spain, excess mortality tracking, which isolates the true fingerprint of a crisis by comparing actual deaths against historical expectations, revealed an estimated 212 heat-linked fatalities in just 4 days. These numbers represent the early visible tip of a much larger structural collapse. The historical precedent of the 2003 European heat wave, which quietly claimed 70,000 lives across the continent, demonstrates that the full impact of these events only emerges weeks later through cold statistical analysis, long after the immediate atmospheric anomaly has passed. The final, most destructive component of this atmospheric trap lies in the breakdown of the diurnal cycle, specifically the phenomenon of the nights that never cool. The human organism is evolutionarily engineered around a predictable pattern of daytime heat load followed by nocturnal recovery. The night is a critical physiological window where ambient temperatures drop, allowing the core body temperature to fall, the heart rate to slow, and the overworked vascular system to reset. Human biology depends on a natural internal temperature dip during the deepest hours of sleep to execute vital cellular repair. When the night remains hot, this entire recovery pathway is blocked. The body enters the subsequent day already depleted and structurally stressed, accumulating a compounding thermal debt that rapidly wears down personal resilience over a prolonged siege. This overnight mechanism is the primary reason that nocturnal low temperatures are a far more accurate statistical predictor of heatwave mortality than daytime peaks. The current hemispheric anomaly is systematically destroying these nocturnal windows across 2 continents. France has just logged its warmest night since 1947. Preventing structural cooling in old stone apartments that absorb solar energy by day and radiate it directly into bedrooms all night long. In Portugal, meteorologists have recorded near-universal tropical nights where the temperature never drops below 20 degrees C. This same deadly baseline shift is manifesting across the United States, where overnight lows in major urban centers are projected to stay above 80 degrees F. This nighttime thermal load is magnified exponentially by the urban heat island effect as concrete, asphalt, and brick act as giant thermal batteries, trapping heat and ensuring the densest human populations experience the highest nocturnal stress. Simultaneously, the baseline humidity profile shifts overnight as ambient temperatures drop slightly, relative humidity climbs, driving the local wet bulb temperature to stubbornly high levels in the dark. A vulnerable or elderly individual sleeping in a non-air-conditioned room at 2 a.m. may be exposed to wet bulb conditions that continuously grind down their cardiovascular architecture, forcing a tired heart to pump thin blood to the periphery until it simply stops. This exact structural sequence drove the 1995 Chicago heat disaster, which quietly claimed over 700 lives in 5 days because the urban core failed to cool down at night, trapping the poor and elderly inside literal brick ovens. This environmental load places a direct, massive strain on the artificial infrastructure we rely on for survival. As millions of cooling units run flat out simultaneously, power grids experience historic demand spikes, pushing transformers and electrical networks towards sudden structural failure. If a grid collapses during an intense heat wave, air conditioning instantly shuts down, delivering an immediate crisis to a population that has lost its physiological margins. Roads buckle, rail lines warp under thermal expansion, and transportation links slow down at the exact moment emergency capacity is required. This vulnerability is heavily concentrated by socioeconomic geography. Poorer urban neighborhoods, which feature less canopy shade, more paved surfaces, and fewer cooling resources, absorb the brunt of the urban heat island effect. The American heartland introduces a final distinct atmospheric load through the phenomenon of corn sweat. Across the vast agricultural expanses of the Midwest, mature corn crops pump massive volumes of water vapor into the lower atmosphere through transpiration. This biological output artificially inflates the local humidity profile, driving the regional heat index up to between 105 degrees F and 110 degrees F. The raw thermometer reading completely hides this agricultural moisture load, masking conditions that forecasters have classified as extreme heat risk across a territory holding 170 million people. This crisis is arriving precisely around the outdoor rituals of the 4th of July, exposing a large population to intense thermal strain during peak exertion. Extreme heat remains the #1 weather-related killer in the United States, outclaiming hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods combined, because it operates without drama. It is a silent, invisible, multi-scalar siege that systematically targets the structural limitations of our biology, our infrastructure, and the fragile, broken currents of the planetary sky. This systemic breakdown exposes the ultimate boundary where physics, geography, and human biology collide. The traditional narrative that extreme heat waves are merely transient, seasonal anomalies, ordinary variations that will pass without fundamentally altering the parameters of life, is entirely deconstructed by the mechanical reality of the data. When the atmospheric circulation of an entire hemisphere shifts into a locked state, it fundamentally alters the baseline of what is possible. By focusing exclusively on raw daytime air temperatures, our public safety frameworks are relying on an outdated ruler that structurally underestimates the true scope of the hazard. This reliance creates a dangerous operational deficit. Our heat indexes and warning thresholds are systematically calibrated to an idealized model of human tolerance that the empirical science has proven to be false. The structural limits of the system are reached well before the absolute threshold of hump and mortality. The transition from what researchers define as survivability to the concept of livability marks a critical boundary for human society. Long before conditions become directly lethal to a healthy adult within 6 hours, they cross a lower, highly sensitive baseline where normal human activity becomes physically impossible. When the wet bulb temperature enters the high 20s and low 30s, outdoor manual labor, industrial commerce, education, and basic civic life grind to a complete halt. The infrastructure of modern civilization is not built to maintain equilibrium under a permanent thermal load. The physical deformation of steel rail lines, the buckling of concrete roadbeds, and the severe overallocation of localized power grids all occur simultaneously because these systems were engineered for a historical climate state that has ceased to exist. This structural contraction of our safety margins means that communities can no longer outwarn or outadapt an event of this geographic and physical magnitude. The vulnerability is absolute, and it is governed entirely by the laws of thermodynamics. When a stationary jet stream wave locks a heat dome over millions of square miles, the resulting energy budget forces a continuous accumulation of heat that cannot be dissipated. It is a closed system running on a massive thermal surplus. The human cost of this surplus is highly concentrated among the invisible marginalized layers of the population: the elderly resident isolated on the top floor of an uncooled urban tenement, the infant unable to regulate internal homeostatic conditions, and the laborer economically compelled to exert themselves in fields heavy with agricultural moisture. For these millions of individuals, the margin between discomfort and a fatal cardiac event has been compressed down to a fraction of a degree on the wet bulb scale. This investigation reveals that we are operating under an atmospheric regime that has crossed a major structural tipping point. The simultaneity of broken records across North America and Europe, the emergence of tropical nights that deny biological recovery, and the rapid degradation of agricultural and urban environments are the clear structural outputs of a broken river in the sky. The shrinking thermal gradient between the rapidly warming Arctic and the tropics has unanchored the planetary winds, moving the baseline upward beneath our feet. We can no longer treat these compounding failures as disconnected, localized weather events or statistical anomalies. They are the predictable, escalating expressions of a global geophysical system being pushed beyond its operational design limits. As the hemispheric machine continues to operate with a reduced thermal buffer, the true line of human survival is no longer a distant theoretical concern for the future. The safety margins have evaporated, and the system is displaying the hard, unyielding limits of an engineered world running out of time.